Hi guys, this is Seth Christensen with the Got Any Cows podcast. 20 years ago, I was an 11-year-old kid with 2 bucket calves. Today, we have sent genetics from our company to 40 of the 50 states and 12 countries around the world. I still learn more every day, and I invite you to learn along with me. So I'm Seth Christensen here with Ty Barnard today for another episode of the Got Any Cows podcast. And Ty is a friend and business associate. We've enjoyed working with Ty closely over the course of the last year in our IVF program, and excited to sit down here today. We're in the WinStar lab. As you can see out and around us, this is a little higher tech than our usual sitting out looking across the valley spot. Excited to be here and chat with Ty. But Ty, give us a little bit of an intro on you and just your background. Fill people in. If somebody had never met you, which I guess most probably won't have that have listened to the podcast today, who were you and how did you end up here in the IVF lab?
Well, thanks, Seth. I'm excited to be with you today and share what I know. My passion is cattle, so I'm excited to be able to come and just talk about cows and IVF. My background, I'm from Iona, Idaho. It's a little town outside of Idaho Falls. Born and raised there, and raised on you can call it a hobby farm, whatever you want to call it. My dad professionally is a dentist, but I'm the youngest of 5 boys. And so
I'm the oldest of 5 boys.
So the farm was to keep the boys out of trouble.
Yeah, well, and you're the favorite if you're the youngest.
And so I doubt the farm ever made any money, but it raised some good boys. And all my brothers have some interest in agriculture, but I'm the one that grabbed it and had a real passion for it, and have chosen to make it my career. So I went on a LDS mission and then came back and started going to school and got married. And my wife and I, we own and operate Liberty Livestock. It's a diversified livestock operation. We raise show cattle, club lambs, club goats, and then we custom feed and do some recipient services for all of those species. So that's what kind of keeps my wife busy and the kids. And then my day-to-day, what pays the bills, is I'm an IVF embryologist. I actually got my degree in ranch management from Texas A&M.
Yeah.
But then
Go Aggies.
That's right. But my passion was in genetics, and that's what I've been doing my whole life. When I was 8 years old is what kind of started things. I had a friend that gave me a couple gilts, and taught me how to AI pigs. And so I was raising pigs like crazy, and I had so many dang pigs that I actually was homeschooled for a few years just to do all my pig chores.
That's awesome.
But then my parents said I need to go back to school, so we ended up selling the pigs, bought into cows and some show lambs, and started flushing in high school, and just got a passion for genetics. And so after I graduated, I wanted to do more in advanced repro, and IVF was the deal for me. And so I started working for WinStar back in 2019, and been mostly just doing the donor work and OPUs. But then last year we actually started our own fertilization company, and so now WinStar does it all in-house from start to finish. So that's my exciting thing I do every day now, is make embryos.
Yeah. So backing up, you mentioned coming through Texas A&M, and then were you at BYUI prior to that? So what did you study at each of the 2 schools, and how did that factor into what you do now?
Yeah, at BYUI it was just animal science. I did have a professor there, Carrie Powell, that was huge into in vivo, and so that kind of gave me a little bit of a desire. And his nephew is the one that was doing a lot of my conventional flushing back in high school. And so I had a good relationship with him, and knew that embryos were something I wanted to pursue. But then I long story short, the Lord just really blesses you, and he sent me to Texas A&M on international scholarship, actually. Usually kids from the U.S. don't get it, but the Lord blessed me, and I got it, and did my degree in ranch management. But one of my professors, he actually owns his own IVF lab.
Oh, really?
And so that kind of gave me a little bit more of an in, and so he's been really helpful as I've been starting this lab. I've been able to reach out and kind of get some tips and hints and figure things out.
Sure. Yeah. So looking at that experience, and that would actually be how you and I got to know each other. Like you'd mentioned, Sean being your embryologist you had used, and Sean has done our conventional work for years, and he's actually recorded a podcast episode with me. And so we've gone through in vivo or conventional, and that's always, I always struggle with the term conventional embryo transfer, because then people get confused, like these are sexed embryos, but they're conventional. Anyway, a whole nother story there, but in vivo, and then they get confused if I say in vivo, because it sounds a lot like in vitro. So in vivo or conventional embryo transfer would be the subject we talked about with Sean, with flushing out of a cow's uterus, whereas in vitro or IVF, embryo transfer would be what we're talking about with you today. So, why would anyone use IVF? Like we've talked about just barely here, in vivo or conventional ET has been available for a long time. You use it, I use it, valuable technology, proven technology, cost effective, high conception rates. Why IVF, if you're going to start into that subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of what I do is genetic consulting. And so when I meet with somebody, it's not automatically you need to come do IVF. There's so many different advanced reproduction techniques that can help you. So we sit down with people, we find out what their goals are, and help them put together a genetic plan. And sometimes that doesn't mean that they're going to come and work with us doing IVF. So AI is a great technology. The in vivo work, genetic testing. I mean, there's so many things. But the reason I kind of go towards IVF is I am a huge proponent of keeping cows in the production system. I don't want to pull a cow out, keep her open for 6 months, a year, just so I can make embryos. Why not make embryos and keep her in the production system? The other reason I really like in vitro is, one, because you can work them when they're pregnant, but two, just the flexibility. You're not committed when you want to do conventional flush and you start the protocol, you're stuck to the protocol. You really can't change, or else you're going to scrap the whole flush. Where in vitro, we can adjust things and pivot pretty easily. So it gives some flexibility. It's a little easier for the cattlemen to actually set up the cows and get things done. We can make it as advanced or as simple as you want. At the end of the day, you just got to show up with a cow, and we're going to take whatever follicles she has. There are things we can do that can improve those follicles and make things better, but it's a lot simpler to do. For the client side. Yes. In the lab side, it gets pretty complex and a lot more work.
You do all the hard work, so I don't have to.
But then just being able to make a lot of embryos from a lot of different donors and sires very quickly. Yes. We can do that a whole lot faster in IVF than we can in vivo. And just being able to use different types of semen, and just it gives you a lot more options.
Right. No, and I'd agree with you. And like you mentioned, specifically with being able to use a pregnant donor. So maybe walk people through why is it that you have to have an open cow for in vivo, and why is it that it's possible to have a cow both be pregnant and producing embryos in an IVF setting, just to understand the logistics of that, or the mechanics of that.
Right. Yeah, so for conventional flushing in vivo, the animal has to be open because you're actually going to breed the animal, and you're going to use the animal's uterus as the incubator. And that's what's going to incubate those embryos.
That uterus is the lab relative
Correct.
to what we're sitting in. Yeah.
And then 7 days later, you can go and flush them out and transfer those embryos. In vitro, we're doing a similar process, but synthetic. We're going to aspirate that cow, pull out the oocytes, and then fertilize them in a petri dish. And so then still 7 days later, we'll have viable embryos, but we're going to use an actual incubator to grow those embryos rather than the cow.
Right. Yep. So to be able to work on a pregnant cow, I mean, I'd say that's one of your major advantages. I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah,
that's huge.
I love working pregnant donors. I won't guarantee you that every pregnant donor does better than a heifer or an open donor, but usually just having that CL and being able to have a healthy uterus is a pregnant uterus, to be honest. And so working a pregnant donor, we usually see increase in our rates, better qualities, and it's a lot more convenient for the producer, because then they know that this cow is pregnant. They know that she's going to calve when they want them to calve, but it hasn't delayed them in making embryos. Right.
And that's it. I mean, I don't know if it can be overstated, the value there, and especially in a beef animal production system. Because for a dairy cow, if a dairy cow is not pregnant, she's still putting milk in the tank, and she's still, paying some bills, right? There's still some revenue coming from that cow. Whereas in a beef cow application, now obviously there's value in the embryos we're making, but if she is sitting open, and more importantly, if she struggles to breed after we've made a bunch of embryos, that can be a real problem if it throws you way outside of a target calving window, or if, here in Idaho, it's significantly different if I calve in September versus if I calve in January. And so, I mean, it's a big deal to be able to say this cow's pregnant, but we're still going to work her. We're still going to be able to get those embryos made. And like you mentioned, for me, because I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum just with the cattle, you're making the embryos. I've got the cows we're trying to make them from. It doesn't take quite near the planning, because for me to plan to make in vivo embryos, both there's a lot of extra production and effort involved on my end, like you mentioned with protocols, but also I have to plan that cow's going to be open. I have to plan that cow's going to have significant time postpartum. I have to plan that I'm going to be able to get her flushed and then manage to get her bred back on time. Or I have to plan that, like, well, this cow's going to sit open for an extended period because I don't want to breed her back right away. So while conventional work is absolutely, it makes great embryos. They're super sticky. They're very cost effective. And it's absolutely something we do a lot of. I still work with Sean a lot, very extensively there. But it's got its limitations. Basically, when I look at it as the two technologies, if a cow is open and kind of right at the prime of her life, she's perfect for conventional work, absolutely. Right? But any cow that is really young, it's an IVF only option. If she's pregnant, if it's an IVF only option. If she's really old, it's an IVF only option. Most cows, truthfully, are one of those three. Not a cow perfectly in her prime, sitting open that I don't need to breed right this second, that I can flush conventionally. So you mentioned as well some of the benefits, I guess, on the lab end, or some options with the semen. Walk us through the differences there between the two technologies, in vivo or conventional, requiring the semen requirements, I guess, it has, or what that looks like, versus what we need for semen to fertilize oocytes in an IVF setting.
Yeah. It gives you a lot of options. So you can use fresh semen. You can use frozen conventional, frozen sexed male or female. You can also do reverse sort. We don't have a reverse sort machine ourselves, but we do have places we can send it to get reverse sorted. And what reverse sort means is that you have a conventional straw of semen, frozen straw of semen, that you want male or female semen out of it. And so then we can run it through a sorting machine to be able to get the majority of the cells to be male or female gametes. Right. And so that's a huge option, a lot for our seed stock producers and some of our show producers. In this day and age, though, truly, if you're using modern sires, you can get about any good sire sexed. Yeah. Where we've run into issues is when we're trying to use legacy sires, they're long time gone, and all we have is these few straws of conventional semen left. Right. But my market needs bulls, or my market needs heifers. Yes. And so then that's when you go to the expense of doing the reverse sort. Yeah. And the other cool thing that I think IVF gives you is if you have poor semen. I'm not going to say you're going to use poor semen and get great results, but you can still make embryos out of it. Right. Where if you try to use poor semen to go breed a cow, or to try to do a conventional flush, you're probably going to strike out. Right. Where with IVF, where they don't have to go through the fallopian tube and go through all this work, the semen is put right in with the oocyte. Yeah. You have a whole lot higher chances of being able to get something to cleave and make an embryo. And
we've seen that, to comment right on exactly what you've said. In one particular bull that was some early generation sexed semen, so it's only put up at 2 million sperm cells per straw. It's been frozen for a long time. Who knows how many times it's changed locations or been shipped or been handled. And who knows how good it was even when it was put up. It's old sexed semen. When we tried to use that conventionally, we struck out in multiple settings, just because the semen was not viable enough, like you mentioned, to do all that work, to find the egg, to fertilize the egg. And we're going through a whole cow's reproductive tract to do its work, versus going right onto an oocyte in a petri dish like what you would do here. We use the exact same bull, the same semen. It's old school, it's sexed, it's not been super viable. We have made a boatload of calves off of an IVF setting, using that same semen here. And the other thing you mentioned, like with these legacy sires, is so applicable within the work we do in Akaushi, because most of those Akaushi bulls, a couple came in the 70s, and then a chunk came in the 90s. And there's been a lot of demand for some of those foundation type genetics genetics, because the genetics, I guess, from those points in time, the 70s and the 90s up until now, so 30 to 50 years ago, they've been pretty tightly held. They've not been particularly available until now. And so there's a lot of people with a lot of interest, I guess, in getting some of those different foundation lines, or kind of building their own foundation to start with Akaushi. So if we're using semen that's 30 to 50 years old, not to mention the fact that it's going to cost thousands of dollars per straw in several cases, but it's quite likely not going to be great semen. And if I used it conventional, I'd have to use at least the single unit, preferably 2 or 3 for one cow.
Oh, right.
Whereas how far can you take a straw in an IVF setting?
Yeah, and that's a huge advantage to IVF with those really expensive straws of semen is we can spread them out. We can spread them out really as far as anybody wants. The further you spread them out, the worse your results are going to be. Conventional straw can easily go over 10 to 15 donors, depending on the amount of oocytes that they give. A sexed frozen straw is going to be right around 80 oocytes, so two, sometimes 3 donors. But yeah, being able to use one straw and spread it across multiple donors, multiple oocytes, that saves the producer a whole lot of money and time, and being able to utilize their semen a lot more efficiently and effectively.
We've had multiple cases now where a single unit has yielded north of 90 transferable embryos, 90 to 100 transferable embryos from one unit. And that's huge. You know, if it's semen that's very, very difficult to get, you've spent thousands of dollars to get it. And now I would mention, this would be an important thing just coming to mind, like you're talking about reverse sort. And the pros and cons of the options there, because it is an incredible technology and can be very valuable. Quite often in the Akaushi world, people are looking for heifers. They're looking to build those foundation herds. But how often do you see, I guess, successful versus unsuccessful sorts, and what does that look like as far as if the sort is unsuccessful, what just happened to your very valuable straw of semen?
Yeah, I'd say with modern semen, you're 75% of the time it's going to roll through the sorter and work just fine. With a lot of those legacy or straws that have been put up outside of the U.S., usually the fail rate's about 50%.
Right.
And so you've had it. We've had other clients that we go and reverse sort a very expensive straw of semen, and it fails. Right. And it's not like we can recover it and use it somewhere else. It's gone. Right. That $2,500 on that straw of semen, it's gone. Right.
No, and that's and that's the reason I mentioned that is, like, I'm looking at. I've had people call and ask, so I'll just use a specific example in Akaushi. The sire of Rusha, 1975 Japanese national champion. The semen's traded up to $22,000 for a single unit. And I've had people say, hey, can you make me Rusha heifers? Well, yes, we can. You know what I mean? The semen is present. But if I were to say, hey, I'm going to take this specific donor, so I guess walking through the process at large, the donor, we don't know exactly how many oocytes she's going to give, and some donors are lower than others anyway. Mm-hmm. Don't know exactly how many oocytes we're going to get. The semen, we don't know exactly how good it is. It's been stored by who knows who for 50 years. And then we're going to send it through a sort machine, and we're going to hope it comes through and we get female sex semen, and then we're going to hope that we get transferable embryos, and then we're going to hope that one of those sticks. I mean, the ask there is extraordinarily high, and I totally understand why people are saying, hey, that sounds great, because I'm like, I'd love to have this super valuable sire, and I want a daughter for my foundation, and that's great, and that's fine, and that's well. But and that's part of why, helping people understand this whole process, like, there's a lot more to be said than to saying, well, I want this donor and this sire and this sex and that recip, and I want it to just magically come on this day. Like, to do that, can it be done? Sure. But I'm going to need a whole pile of donors, a whole pile of semen, probably multiple sort attempts, multiple transfer dates. I'm going to hope they stick, and then I'm going to hope that I got a recip to come and heat at the right time to put the right embryo in the right recip so we can transfer fresh so that we don't lose success rate with frozens. Anyway, there's so many moving pieces, and I think that's where it's so important, and why I'm so excited to sit here and talk through the process with you, is just help people. It's been an education for me. You and I have spent a lot of time on the phone in the last year as you've continued to educate, and I've dealt with IVF for a long time, but you've continued to educate me on your processes so that I understand, okay, if the end goal is a Rusha daughter, for example, or whatever it may be, there's a lot of moving pieces between point A and point B, and what that all looks like.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's things like that historically have probably given IVF a bad rap, is we are using very expensive semen, or semen that might be low quality, and we're trying to spread it out so far, or run it through a reverse sort machine. Every time we handle embryos or oocytes or semen, we're hurting it.
Yeah.
And so the less we can do that, the better.
Right.
But when we're using this 50-plus-year-old semen and trying to make that very specific thing, a lot of times we have low results.
Right.
But
Right.
if you use high quality conventional semen and you use 1 or 2 donors and you don't have it transferred very often, you can have results very comparable to conventional.
Yeah.
But it's what are you going to give up to get the exact thing that you want?
Right.
And
right.
what's your
right.
risk level?
Right, right. Well, and I think, the alternative approach, and this is what I've ended up doing, now that we've done it as long as we have, and we're looking at all the different approaches, the different donors we can use, conventional work, IVF work, whatever our options are. So for going back to that Rusha example, the target for us, we decided, well, rather than risk, we might get nothing at all if we attempted to sort. You know what I mean? We might get zero anything. We might get zero anything anyway. It might be the day I bring that straw to you and we put it under the scope. Like, well, darn, somebody somewhere along this 50-year chain of custody botched their job and one tank went dry one time and this semen's all dead anyway. So that's a possibility. But we're going to take it and we're going to push it across as many donors as we can, with the intent being we're going to get as many total embryos as we can. Because are we going to end up with some males there? Yep. But would I rather have some males I wasn't necessarily targeting, though I'm good with the males. You know what I mean? Like we need those sons and there's values in those sons and we've got use for those sons. They weren't the target, but I'd rather have those extra males than say we torched the straw trying to sort it.
And no females.
And no females. And or saying like, well, this is the exact donor I want and I for sure want a daughter. Like, well, I'd rather have a daughter maybe from a different donor than I got no daughters at all. And so that's again, I mean, it's one example and I'm one producer making one decision with one unit of semen. But with stuff that is that valuable and that rare, and I mean, you can get a hold of it, but you're going to pay, and we're going to take it and push it as far as we can across a series of donors. And then we'll make those embryos. We'll transfer, if not all of them fresh, most of them fresh, just to pick up that added conception rate. And we'll see what we get, I mean, and in I'm just hoping we make some at all. It is going to be great. You know what I mean? But hopefully, we get a good chunk of them, and there will be heifers in there from some different donors, and we'll put them in some great recips, and there'll be all those different pieces in place. But I think, just helping people understand that, there's a lot at play here. It's a lot more than just saying, hey, Ty, I need a daughter of a 1975 Japanese national champion, to show up on this day in this recip from that donor, and it's got to be female, and I don't want you to bill me a whole lot of anything, there's quite a process, at play here. So jumping back just a step, one thing I wanted to touch on that I forgot about, I mentioned briefly young and old donors. You and I were just on the phone the other day talking heifers. Walk me through heifers specifically as donor candidates, some of the reasons we do use heifers as donors, and you use them more so in the dairy industry, and then some of the, risks involved or how you mitigate or manage those.
Yeah. Heifers are a great tool. In the dairy world, we primarily work heifers because we're trying to shorten the genetic interval as much as possible. Yeah. So the sooner we can get new, fresh genetics out, the better it is for our company.
And I'm going to pause you actually real quick, just because this is important, and I'm really glad you mentioned it, and I apologize, I'm cutting you right off. I'm like, let me ask you one question, then switch it. But you mentioned something important, genetic interval and genetic change, as far as being able to roll generations and move populations. In Akiushi, we are fascinated with these legacy sires that are 30 to 50 years old. Like, well, I only want one off one of these foundation sires, which is great and fine and well. I do it. Plenty of other breeders do it. There's value to it. There's reasons to do it from I guess, an outcross standpoint or maintaining genetic diversity. But I'm sitting here in a breed that's using 50-year-old semen. You're sitting here in a breed that it's like the second we can collect the donor and or the stud, we're doing it, and we're rolling as tight and as fast as we can. Why is there value in focusing on the next generation instead of just saying, well, it's got to be original import, or I've got to get a Holstein Friesian from the 19 whatevers? Why do you use the newest? What's the value there in rolling generations?
Yeah, we have an ever-changing market, and you just think about the amount of people that we're trying to feed is continuing to grow. But the amount of acres we have to farm and the amount of cows we have to produce either that milk or meat is continuing to get less. And so we have to continually to change and to improve to be able to keep up with those demands. especially in the milk cow world, I mean, we can't be milking the cows that Grandpa was milking 50 years ago.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I don't think people realize the change. What did a cow do 50 years ago? I mean, for daily milk, they made what? 30 pounds, 40
yeah,
pounds, if
yeah.
that?
If you had a 60-pound cow, you were top dog, and now we cull 60-pound cows.
I mean, now top cows, I mean, there's a lot of cows that'll do 80 to 100, and your top ones, I mean,
Oh,
setting
130,
records at what?
140.
Yeah, getting clear
Yeah.
up there.
And so, and it's not all about the production. I mean, we have to have fitness traits, wellness traits. We got to keep feet and legs on these cows. And we've got to keep the milk and the fat in there as well. And so that's where we have to use these young sires and these young donors to be able to make the change that we need to quick enough. The dairy industry, even though we are so far advanced of a lot of our other industries, we're still way behind trying to keep up with feeding the world.
Right.
And so we have to continue to evolve. And yeah, is there risk in using young sires and young donors? For sure.
Yeah.
And you're going to have some matings that just don't work. But when you do have the matings that do work and you can shorten that genetic interval and you can set up to make the next generation more sustainable, I mean, that's our goal, is we put cows first and we're trying to be able to allow cows to do what God put them on the earth for, to provide for us. And they're not going to do it by themselves, so we have to help support them. And that's where IVF has really helped, especially in the dairy world, is we can shorten that genetic interval and be able to make progress a lot faster. Now, there's nothing wrong with the legacy sires and things, because you do need that to, like you said, to keep genetic diversity and to keep a base. And so we have some genetic lines that we do mate to older sires and things to keep a base. So then, depending on what the market does, we don't have to totally backtrack. We can use this genetic base and pivot however we need to. But to be able to produce what we need to produce, we can't just stay on either side of the bell curve. We got to try to be right there at the peak. So that's where using the young sires really comes in.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned, I mean, with multi-trait selection versus single trait, and that's, I mean, it's happened in every breed. It's happened with every production target. I mean, with Holsteins, it can be we're only going to make all the milk we can possibly make. And like you mentioned, things like components can fall apart. Things like health traits can fall apart. Things like fertility, longevity can fall apart. But yeah, they sure enough milk 200 pounds a day on some of these record cows, you know. But the same premise, you know, happens in Akaushi specifically. It's marbling. You know, it's like, well, you know, we just got to marbling. We got to have marbling. We got to have marbling. Like, well, what happens if the cow's going to eat you every time you're around it? You know what I mean? What happens if you have to pull every calf she ever has? What happens if she won't breed back? What happens if the calf's a dink and won't hardly gain at all? You know what I mean? And so everyone's just like thoroughly unimpressed with the cattle. So now, never mind what that carcass is going to be like. It took you 4 years to get there, you know? So I think it's important when we talk about multi-trait selection, and that's kind of what we end up doing. And why we use all these different technologies, you know, the in vivo and the in vitro, but also the different sires. We're using 50-year-old bulls, you know, to broaden that genetic base, to make sure we hold on to and maintain that genetic diversity, given that there were so few original imports. And so there's value to preserving and maintaining that legacy, like you mentioned, for a base. But you also know right here in this lab, I mean, you have used young females from our program. You've used young studs. I mean, studs that won't freeze semen yet, but we're already pushing them to make IVF embryos, and that's letting us shorten that genetic interval because we want to affect genetic change on production traits. So we're doing both within our program and leveraging IVF technology in both settings to say, hey, we want to maintain this genetic base, but also I want to push to do all those things I just mentioned. I want to make cows that are better mannered, easier calving, faster growing, higher marbling, and longer lasting. Like, that is our selection criteria in priority order spelled out. And I think everyone's going to have a little different target. You know, I mean, clearly the targets in dairy and beef are distinctly different. The targets between breeds are different, and the targets between programs are different. But IVF as a technology is something you can leverage to make faster genetic change, because you can shorten that genetic interval towards whatever your target may be. So you and I were talking just the other day about getting females rebred. And this is a subject that I was just talking with a client about it yesterday. And I'm trying to think the best way to frame this question. When it comes to just managing females, we're trying to achieve both targets, and this is just the same conversation you and I have just had. How do we try to affect genetic change as quickly as possible? Meaning, make embryos as early as possible, get those calves coming, but also get that female to breed. What do you guys see for the balance there, the risks and rewards, and looking at conventional versus IVF work on heifers? What approach do you take? Because I'm going to have people ask me on a very regular basis. They're brand new to Akiushi. They've got some young Akiushi females. They're excited to make that next generation. They want to make embryos. And I tell them, yes, we can make embryos. In my program, we do make embryos from heifers. But how do we go about saying, hey, I want to get embryos made, but I also need to get this female to breed for the first time? How do you navigate that scenario? That's an ever-changing thing for me.
Right.
I was just asking you personally the other day.
It's very donor dependent and very client dependent. So we have a lot of clients that they would rather risk not being able to get that heifer bred on time in order to make as many embryos as quickly as they can. Sure. And that for WinStar, that's our big priority is that cow, that heifer has more genetic value in making embryos than she does actually getting to milk. Right. Now, we want them to get to milk. We want to prove out our genetics, and they will get there someday. Yeah. But we're okay taking an extra year to actually get them into milk just so we can make as many embryos as we can. And so you've got to find out what are your goals, what embryos do you need, and when do you want to put them in, and how can we manage that. And so we love to sit down and actually talk to people and figure that out. Right. Working heifers is a great thing, but they are very inconsistent. We don't know exactly what they're going to make that first time, and then after that first time, we kind of have an idea, but they are way less inconsistent than cows. Yes. They'll throw you 18 one week and then 3 the next week. Yes. And just with the type of procedure that it is, you can cause harm. Now, I would say you're way less likely to cause harm in the IVF system than you are in the conventional system. I agree with that. And so that's a big pro for using IVF in heifers. But we do see that we can delay the breeding on heifers, or the uterine tract can get damaged either from what we do or just from using FSH and different things. Yes. And they might not breed back, or that you might have to use a bull to get them bred that first time. Right. Now, that's usually more rare than common, especially with a lot of our beef clients. They'll only work them 2 or 3 times before they try to get them bred, where in the Holstein world, we're working them till, I'm embarrassed to say, but sometimes 18, 20 months before we start breeding them, just because we're trying to make so many embryos. Yes. And so on the Holsteins, we have a higher majority that are hard breeders, but it's because we have worked those ovaries so hard. Right. Or we've gotten them a little over-conditioned because we're trying to have them on that positive plane of nutrition to try to make good quality embryos. Yeah. Fat cows just don't get pregnant. Right. No, you're completely right. Yep. So there are disadvantages to working heifers. So a lot of our beef clients, when possible, depending on what their goals are, I encourage them to get those heifers pregnant first. Because then if they're carrying a pregnancy, they have a healthy uterus, and we can continue to make embryos. Right. And depending on the heifer, we can make embryos up to 5 months pregnant, sometimes longer, sometimes a little shorter. Just depends on when that calf actually finally slips over the pelvis. And so that's a huge advantage is that you can work heifers, but I do recommend a lot of times get the heifer pregnant and then work her. Right. Yep. No, and I'd agree with you there. I mean, and for me, this is a day-to-day thing that both I run into in my program and that clients run into in theirs is what do I do with that heifer? How do I guess, best leverage her or make best use of her? And when I look at it, and I've kind of tried all of the above, you know what I mean? And I wouldn't say that I've got it perfectly dialed in. This is what I'll do every time, because it is donor dependent. What are we trying to get done here? Like you mentioned, identify the goal for the animal, and then we can kind of figure out a plan as to how do we achieve that. But historically, I had worked conventional. I had done some conventional flushes on heifers, and sometimes we got along totally fine with that. You know what I mean? We'd flush them 1, 2, even 3 times, and they'd breed right back, and it was no big deal. It was no problem at all. We had some other situations in which we flushed those heifers. They may or may not even have flushed that well as far as making any embryos conventionally, and then they were very difficult to breed thereafter. And so that's not always, it was a little hit or miss as to what we saw there, but we had it happen enough times. And I thought, well, we're going to kind of shift over to more so IVF. And on the IVF side, it has been kind of the same in the sense that
We'd work them one time and then go to breeding them. Some females had zero problem with that. You know what I mean? Like we'd work them once, we'd make a set of embryos, which is neat. Like I've got big chunks of flush siblings coming this fall that'll be born fall of 25 from those heifers, right? So to be fair, having taken that risk, even in the case of the ones that were a little slower to breed back, I got a big group of calves from her, not just one, if I'd have bred her natural. And so there was value there and enough value to be worth the risk for me within my program. But then we did have some of those females that didn't want to breed back right away. And I think that's an important thing for any individual making the decision on a heifer. Weigh the value and the risk. Is the reward of like, yep, I've got a set of flush babies coming, worth the risk of I might not have a natural calf coming out of that donor right away. If it is, I'd say go ahead and start working them. If you say no, like it is more important to me that this female get in calf herself, that she breed right away, that she not be difficult to breed, that we not require multiple services or whatever else, well, then you're probably better to get her pregnant first and then go to working her. And I'm looking at it for me and my program going forward, our target by and large as to how to manage heifers to leverage both, to try to get the genetic value and get the embryos and get her to breed back first time is exactly what you had suggested, and say, hey, let's get them pregnant first, and then you can work that heifer at least the first 3 months, usually 4, 5. We've had some almost 6, that we've been able to get oocytes out of. And then we've got both. We had to wait, and this is the downside. This is the trick. Is like we had to wait till she was pregnant. How far pregnant before you'd say you start working them?
40 days.
Yeah.
60 days.
So we had to wait, at least 6 weeks. We had to get her old enough to breed first, then at least 6 weeks into the pregnancy. And that's always kind of our fine dance, is we're targeting a really specific calving season. And so then it's like, well, do I want the flush babies or do I want the natural baby? Because I'm not going to get both on the exact same window here, is kind of what I'm looking at. But for us going forward, we'll probably generally gear towards I'm going to breed her natural, and then I'll start working her IVF, or just wait and work her conventional after she calves. Unless it's one that are saying, we have to have more of these. I have to have them now. It is okay that she may not breed for me right away. In that setting, I'll say, we're going to work her. We're going to work her IVF. We're going to work her right away. What's the youngest you can work a heifer?
Right around 8 months is what we typically tell people. There are some people that will go shorter than that, but, my motto is cows first. We got to make sure those cows are healthy and that we're taking care of them. If you take care of the cows will take care of you. Yeah. And so right around that 8-month mark is a good time to start working the heifers if you're going to start working them.
Right. And if somebody wants to, and for us, where we're only going to end up taking, depending on the female, 1, 2, maybe 3 aspirations. A lot of times we don't even start working ours until they're, be 12 months, 12, 13, 14. And I have seen, just like you mentioned, the farther mature they are, the better they do. Older heifers do better than younger heifers, and pregnant heifers do better than open heifers, and mature cows do better than heifers as well. And so that's, again, coming back around to the conventional discussion, the ideal donor still is the ideal conventional donor has to be open, but at a minimum, the ideal donor across the board is probably at the prime of her life, and is a productive cow. But we can make it work quite a little bit younger in IVF. So anyway, big deal there to be able to work young donors, pregnant donors, old donors. You mentioned as well the interval between conventional flushes versus IVF flushes. Walk us through that and how that works. How often you can work them IVF versus how often conventional.
Yeah, so you can work them conventionally around every 5 weeks. IVF, you can work them as quickly as every week. We recommend every 2 weeks. You can do 3-week intervals or whatever works for what recipients are going into. But 2-week intervals work really well because you're going to stay on the same follicular wave. And so you're catching them at the top of that follicular wave every single time. If you go to every week or every 3 weeks or less, then you're going to hit and miss that follicular wave, which all that's going to do is going to change the quality of those oocytes. We're still going to be able to make embryos most of the time, but they're going to not be as consistent. 1 week, she might make you 15 and they might be really good quality. And then 3 weeks later, you'll do her and she might make you 8 and they're a little lower quality. They'll still make embryos. But so keeping them, once you start working an animal IVF, they usually get better the more that you work them to a certain extent. They can get wore out and those ovaries need time to rest. Yeah. But usually that first time is kind of hit or miss on how well they're going to do. Yeah. We got to dial in what exact protocol we're going to do with her. And then once those ovaries get into that rhythm, then they usually just stay consistent and do really well.
Right. And we've had really, really good luck where possible. And again, there's a million things you're dancing: recip timeline, technician timeline, embryo timeline, semen timeline, donor timeline, time of the year timeline. I mean, a lot we're trying to dance. Like, I made a real mess of our schedule last fall, just too many moving pieces, and anyway, made it hard for everybody. But when I look at an ideal setting, if I can, whether it's heifers or cows, if I can get them pregnant, and then from that 40-day mark, clear out to 100, 120, even 150 days, work them every couple of weeks while they're carrying a calf, that has just worked really well for us. Whether it's heifers, whether it's cows, whatever else, that, like you mentioned, takes advantage of those follicular waves, keeps them right on a steady schedule. They're already pregnant, so we don't have to worry about that end of it. We know that they're mature enough. We know that there's all the pieces kind of seem to be in place. And I can work them every 2 weeks and make a whole series of embryos without giving up, or without making them hard to breed, without giving up the natural calf. And you're just, you're firing on all cylinders at that point. You know what I mean? You've got this cow in the very best position she could be in for long-term productivity. She's pregnant. We're making embryos as fast as I could trim it right down to once a week, but we're going bi-weekly stimulated is what we've been doing. Could go weekly unstimulated. But making a whole pile of embryos, getting a natural calf, cow looks great, calves are looking great, making a pile of calves. That's a pretty ideal setting if we're trying to kind of maximize production from that donor. Hey guys, this is Seth Christensen with the Got Any Cows podcast. I wanted to give you guys a personal invitation to check out our website. That's gotanycows.com. Gotanycows.com is going to take you to the Christensen Genetics website. On that website, we've got a couple of different things that I would like you to take advantage of. One of the first tabs that you'll see there across the top on the Christensen Genetics website is the podcast tab. You can find any and all of the episodes that have been released there, along with full video. The next tab over would be the Learn tab. The point of everything on this tab would be to help educate somebody that maybe doesn't have cattle yet, help you prepare to be ready to own your own cows. We help people on a regular basis establish new herds, build a quality set of cattle. The Learn tab is all about being ready for cattle ownership. The next tab that you'll see on the top of the website there is the Build Your Herd tab. This is going to have our current sale inventory on it. It'll have everything from semen and embryos to females, bulls, all of the above. It's all there. There's going to be pictures there. There's going to be registration links there. There's going to be pricing there. All of the live animals on christensengenetics.com come with free delivery anywhere in the continental United States included. So if you decide to purchase any of these animals, all you have to do is click the click to buy button that is included on each of those listings. That'll send an email to us. We'll send an invoice to you. Once you pay that invoice, we'll go ahead and schedule a brand inspection, a health inspection, and shipment to your ranch. And then after that, the next tab is the Run Your Ranch tab. So this would be where you can find information on what to do when you receive those animals, vaccination protocols, nutrition recommendations, calving recommendations, shipping, marketing, anything that you might need to do once you own the cattle. So the whole point of this website at large of gotanycows.com is meant to help you prepare to own cows, purchase the best cows you can possibly get, and then know what to do with them. So I'd invite you guys to take advantage of that resource. We built it for you. It's there to use. Please go ahead and visit gotanycows.com. Be sure to subscribe at the bottom of the page, and you'll receive updates as things are added to the site. Again, that's gotanycows.com, and we'll see you there. So we've been talking about IVF and kind of where it fits, why we'd use it, some of the different donor types it fits, some of the different semen types it fits. So say somebody's decided, hey, Ty, you know what? I want to go ahead and do some IVF work. I've got some donors picked out, some sires picked out. Walk me through the process, I guess, at large, just like any given new client calls you up. Somebody listening to this podcast says, hey, Ty knows his stuff. I want him to make IVF embryos for me. What does that look like from the time they call you until you deliver embryos to them? So I guess starting with scheduling, sire selection, all that stuff.
Yeah. If they haven't been involved in IVF before, I love to meet with them and just kind of explain the process, walk them through how it works and what for them to expect and what they expect of us. So usually we like to have a 2 to 4 week heads up before we start running donors. Now I get raising cattle, things change, you need things done as soon as possible. So we will accommodate anything that we can do. But 2 weeks is really nice for helping me put together my production schedules. But just people contact me. We'll talk about the process, and then we'll get them scheduled. They'll bring their cows in.
And I'm actually going to pause you real quick just because you mentioned it. You've mentioned so many things today, Ty, that I've been like, oh man, I need to hit on this because they're all really valuable and important things to understand that they are. I forget about them until you mention them, but you talk about scheduling and the leeway there. We're into spring right now. We're March as we're recording this. Shipping semen and availability of shippers. How much leeway or heads up do they need to give wherever the semen's coming from? Because I think this is one of our more common challenges, at least for me and in what I do. People say, oh yeah, like I need frozen genetics. It's anywhere March through June is where shipper availability is nuts because the whole world is trying to breed all at once. And yeah, I want this semen put onto that, either AI or ET or whatever. These frozen genetics. Oh yeah, and I pulled cedars like yesterday. So I mean, I'm gonna, I'm gonna be like breeding right away. How much time do they need to have to get the semen to you? As far as heads up there, so that it's not you saying, well, yeah, we're planning to IVF to bull X tomorrow, and oh yeah, I haven't ordered the semen yet. Yeah. Walk us through that timeline.
This time of year, you're talking 4 to 6 weeks, especially if you're getting it from either a large stud company or a company that brings in a lot of studs. If you're buying it from farm and that farm has shippers, it will be shorter. Typically, it's 2 weeks to be able to get a shipper to you and back. But right now, we're getting close to peak breeding season, so it gets a little hard to get semen here. A lot of times we have people just ship it to themselves and put it in their tanks if they have tanks, and then just bring the semen with them when they bring the donors. If you're going to board donors with us, then we'll have you bring the semen. We'll keep it here. You can drop ship stuff to us. Just let me know when it's coming and what to expect, so I make sure I get it processed and inventory properly. But yeah, right around that 4 to 6 weeks mark. So when you're thinking about getting semen in, touch base with me, and let's get you on the books and kind of schedule it all at the same time. So then we can talk through options, and you can decide what bowls you want to use. Then you can go search for those bowls, get them here before we're ready to fertilize.
Right. Well, I say this as if I had passed this hurdle in my life. Like this breeding season, I've known what sires I'm going to use. I know they're coming from here. I know I need to get them shipped. But as per always, there's 500 other things to do. Cows demand attention. People need taken care of. And then all of a sudden we're like coming right up on aspiration day. I'm like, this semen's sitting in Texas, and so then we're either having to switch sires, or we're having to pay for a rush shipment that often doesn't get it there anyway. Or there's not a shipper available to send it, even if UPS could haul it, which they most often don't. And so, or they'll charge you for next day, but it still just means 3 or 4 days out with most shipments. So anyway, I think that's a good thing to understand. So if they decide, we're all scheduled, we've got a sire picked out, we've got a donor picked out, what does it look like on aspiration day?
Yeah, so aspiration day, either you can haul in or you can board with us. A lot of clients haul in, and honestly, the process only takes 15 to 20 minutes. It really doesn't take a lot of time. What takes more time is cattlemen. We all like to talk, and so we sit there and we talk longer than what it actually takes to do the procedure. But you'll come in and we'll run the donors into the collection facility. We'll deaden their tail with lidocaine, and then we have a veterinarian that he comes and he does our aspirations for us. And it's a ultrasound guided needle is what we use. And so the veterinarian will palpate the ovaries, and he'll use that ultrasound to be able to see the follicles. And the oocytes are within those follicles. And so then we use a needle that's guided by that ultrasound to be able to aspirate the oocyte out of that follicle. And so it's a vacuum that actually sucks that out, puts it into a conical tube, and then he'll aspirate both ovaries, and then once that conical tube is full, he'll hand it to me in the lab, and I'll filter it. Because we're going through the abdomen to be able to get to the ovary, there's a little bit of blood. It's not like surgery necessarily, but there's blood and mucus and things, and so it's different than like a conventional flush. You can just sit down and start searching it. You've got to filter out that blood and that mucus, and then we'll search those oocytes, and then once we've found everything that's there, we put them in a maturation tube. And so that maturation tube, it just has media in it that kind of feeds that oocyte and keeps it healthy. And then the next day, we'll fertilize those oocytes. So we'll transfer those oocytes out of the maturation media into a fertilization media. It's just a little bit different. The maturation media is designed to help oocytes grow. The fertilization media is designed to give the semen the most success. So then we'll transfer those oocytes into that media. We'll thaw the semen, we'll process it, and then we'll actually do the fertilization, add the semen to the oocytes, and then that sits overnight again. And then the next day we'll clean up and strip all of the dead sperm cells off of that. It's now called a zygote. And we'll strip all those dead cells off and then move the resulting zygotes into a culture media. And that culture media, different than the fertilization, the maturation media, it's designed for embryos. It's designed to feed them and help them grow for the next 6 days. And so then they'll sit in that incubator for around anywhere from 5 to 7 days, depending on what the goal is with the embryos. If we have to ship them really far across the country, especially in the wintertime, then we usually pull them out on day 5, just so if something goes wrong, we have an extra day to get them there before they need to be transferred. If you're going to be semi-local or we don't have to ship them very far, we'll pull them out on day 6. We'll put them into a shipping tube or into straws and ship them to you. The best is to try to do it on day 7 when possible, but not everybody's recips are right here close. So on day 7, we can either freeze those and then ship them to you, or if you're close enough and have a technician available, either one of ours or another one, then we can load them into straws or into shipping tubes if you have somebody that can load them on farm. And then you put in your fresh embryos on day 7.
Yeah.
And so the process really starts the week before, or 2 weeks before you schedule with us. And then usually about 60 to 75 hours before you're going to start stimulation, if you're going to stimulate them, we like to do a DFR. So our protocol is we do a DFR, dominant follicle reduction. Right. So we go in very similar to as if we were going to aspirate those ovaries, and we just take off the largest follicle, the dominant follicle. Yeah. And we do this really regardless if we're going to stimulate them or not. Because then that helps balance out those ovaries, and so those oocytes or those follicles grow at the same rate. Right. And so we'll do that dominant follicle reduction, and then in our protocol, not everybody will do this, we put in a cedar. If they're an open donor, if they're pregnant, they don't need it. And the reason we do that is not because we're trying to set them up or sink them necessarily. It's because we have found that follicles developed under the presence of progesterone are better quality follicles.
Just like from a pregnant cow.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's why we don't have to use it with the pregnant cows. She's got that CL, which is putting off way more progesterone than we could ever fit into a cedar. Right. And so that's usually why I tell people pregnant donors usually do better, because that whole process is being done under the presence of progesterone. And so we give them put in a cedar, and we, regardless if we aspirate them for a DFR or not, we still give them a shot of GnRH. And the reason we do that is any follicle that will respond to GnRH, that 60 to 75 hours before you start stimulation, we don't want them on day of OPU anyway, because they'll be too mature. And so we use that GnRH to just slough off anything that will respond.
Right. So the GnRH would kind of take the place of the dominant follicle reduction that you would do manually.
Yep. Yeah. And then you will start stimulation about 60 to 75 hours after that if you choose to. We used to be like 100% FSH, stimulate everything. And it has its place and is useful in certain circumstances and situations. But I have actually gone nearly to the opposite, where we stimulate very few now. The difference between stimulating and not stimulating, everybody thinks, well, if I stimulate, I'm going to get a bunch more embryos. Not necessarily. Stimulation typically might give you higher quality embryos. So rather than making as many grade 1s and 2s, maybe you'll make more grade 1s instead of grade 2s. But it just depends on the donor. And so if we have a donor that is producing oocytes but consistently giving me grade 2s, then I'll start her on stimulation. Or if she's my number one donor, I need to make as many as high quality as possible as fast as I can. Yeah, we'll stimulate her. The trick with being successful unstimulated is knowing where those cows are in their cycle and being able to balance their follicular wave. And so that's why if you're going to go unstimulated, it really works well to work them every 2 weeks. Because then once we can get them on that right follicular wave, we can keep them there. And if we're struggling to get them on that wave, then we need to get them in heat about 10 to 15 hours before we would do the DFR. And that really helps get them in that right phase to make the highest quality oocytes. And we like to think that better quality follicles make better quality oocytes, which make better quality embryos, better quality conception rates. Sure. And so that's the goal. So no, non-stimulation has its place and can work very well. It's maybe a little bit more time consuming. You got to know your cows a little bit more and it's just another level of management. Unstimulated is pretty easy. You can make it successful a lot easier than non-stim, but it also comes with the added cost of FSH, which right now is not cheap at all.
Right. 20 mil for $260 if you're buying it at retail.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then we'll stimulate them. There's so many different stimulation protocols out there. We've tried everything under the sun. I really like using hydrochloric acid to be able to only give a one-shot protocol, but that just got discontinued. And so we're actually doing some R&D on some other things to be able to do a one-shot protocol. Sure. There are people that just do a super concentrated dose with just regular diluent. It works for some people. It makes me nervous because we're really blowing up those ovaries really quick.
Right, it would scare me a little. Yeah.
But it does work for some people, especially if they're only going to do one aspiration.
Sure. Yeah.
I like a 4-shot protocol. That is the most consistent. People do 6 or 8 or 3. 4-shot protocols work the best for us and for our clients, and so that's what we stick with. Yeah. And we're using a lot less FSH than what you would use in a conventional system. Right.
I think that's one of the big differences, going back to our heifer conversation. I think, honestly, there's a series of differences between IVF and conventional, but getting drastically less FSH, even in a stimulated protocol versus a conventional in vivo, I do think that's been helpful in our heifers doing better breeding afterwards. Yeah. So didn't mean to cut you off. You just mentioned a lot of really good stuff.
Yeah, no, and so FSH definitely has its place, but you just got to weigh your options and what are your goals. And I'll help people do that as they call in and we decide what they need to do. But then, like I said, you bring them here, we'll get them collected. It only takes 15, 20 minutes, and then I'll run it through the whole process. A lot of people, because they're real eager to find out the results, they'll ask me on day 6 what I'd rather not look at them on day 6, especially if I'm going to freeze them, because the less times I handle those embryos, the better they're going to be. Sure. And so a lot of times I'll let people know on day 7 what we froze, and then we'll just work on getting them shipped to you, or if you're going to continue to be working donors through us, and we'll just get you embryos as you stop by, and we got a tank around to put them in.
So on OPU day, you'll usually give me an oocyte count. I guess the most common questions I get from people that have either purchased an aspiration from me or are buying embryos or that we're making custom pregnancies or even just that they're working their own elsewhere and they want to call me and ask about them. What is quote unquote normal? And I say quote unquote because the range is so wide. Mm-hmm. But what's a normal oocyte count? And then what do you expect that to turn into for transferables? Because I've had confusion before. People say, oh man, we got 25 oocytes. Like I'm going to have 25 embryos to transfer, What's a normal oocyte count? And then what's a normal transferable? And like you mentioned, I guess there'd be 8 days between those points. There'd be aspiration day on which we'll find out how many oocytes we have. The following day you start fertilizations, and then 7 days after that, so 8 days after aspiration, we know how many we have to either transfer fresh or freeze. So what, managing expectations wise, what should someone expect? Again, very hard to project. I'm putting you on the spot here. This is the question everyone asks, but no one has a perfect answer to.
There is not a good answer to it. It's donor dependent, breed dependent, operation dependent. We've had cows in our management system that have done XYZ, and then we sell that cow to another management system, and they're like, well, this cow just doesn't produce. Well, it's a different management system. The cow hasn't really changed. It's the management that has changed. And so there's so many variables. Using your cows as an example, we've had some of your donors that have given us nearly 60 oocytes, and one that gives us consistently 1 oocyte. Right. Exactly. And so, you're 1 to 60. I would say I can't remember if it's AETA or IETS. Those are embryo associations. One of them did put out some numbers there. I think in the dairy side, the average oocyte numbers were about 13 oocytes per OPU. Beef, I think, was 16. I would say in our system, we're typically a little higher than that. Our Holsteins average right around 20. And our beef producers are probably that 20, 25. But it's very donor dependent. And then out of that, you're going to probably get, right around 60% of those to actually cleave. So meaning that the semen actually did its work. And then out of that 60, then you're going to have probably 40% that actually turn into viable embryos. And then you take that the next step, you're probably only going to have 40% of those that actually stick. And so you can't set your expectations at, I made 20 oocytes, I'm going to have 20 embryos and 20 live calves. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
But because the interval of being able to work them is so much shorter, we can make a whole lot more embryos than we could in a conventional system in a shorter amount of time, and be able to use the same donor to multiple different bowls and put all those embryos in at the same time. Right. So you have an assortment of different calves when you need them.
Right.
So there's those advantages. But yeah, because we are putting the human side into it, not using the cow as the incubator, there's so much more variables and so many things that can go wrong. Right. That we definitely expect our rates to be a little bit lower.
Sure, you bet. And I would say, I mean, and again, these are just spitball numbers. You gave us some good spitball numbers as well. Yours are much better than spitball. Yours are at least good data based. I'm saying spitball because my sample size is smaller. You're running this all day, every day. I mean, we're doing 500 IVFs or whatever in a year. And looking at, for us, I mean, like a pretty normal day, just to give people an idea. And again, you mentioned we've got one cow, the old hag, that is 18 years old, and she barely squeaks out embryos, and we've got others that'll dump them. But most on a normal day, I'd say, cow rolls in, say she makes 25 oocytes. That's the number you give me on the day we aspirate. 8 days later, 5 transferable embryos. One out of every 5 came through and is ready for transfer, and it's good to go in. And then out of those 5, now I guess I'll put an asterisk here. We've had drastically higher success rates this year thanks to your work in this lab. I mean, we've had exceptional rates, but I'm always one, whenever I run my projections on anything, whether it's business or on embryo production, I'd much rather run a conservative projection and be really pleasantly surprised than be like, oh yeah, it's all going to go 100% perfect every time, way over the top, ridiculously good, and then it's terrible. So my projection that I run is on 40% success rates with IVF. And so if I made 25 oocytes the day we collected, 5 transferables the day the embryos came in, stuck them into five recipient cows, 2 of those turn into pregnancies. Statistically, 1 is a female. You know what I mean? And so that's just to give people kind of, really, really ballpark, but very easy to remember, for a producer standpoint. That's kind of what I'd anticipate. Like, well, if we aspirate them today, there's going to be times way higher, times way lower, but it's probably semi-reasonable to say, well, we might get a bull and a heifer from this one conventional, or 2 heifers if we did sexed semen. Or, you can go reverse sort, but if you do, it may or may not sort. You might need a couple units to get it to sort. I prefer, anywhere I can, to use either semen that was frozen as sexed semen rather than throw that extra loop of the sexing reverse sort step into the process. So jump into staging and grading day. Stages and grades. I have people ask me on a very regular basis, so what do the stages even mean? What do the grades even mean? Which number is which? Should I care? Should I not? Tell me what the stages and the grades are, and why people should care or not.
Yeah. So the stages go technically from 1 to 10, but really what you hear is 3 to 9. In the in vivo system, you're going to see 3s to 7s. We really like to freeze 4s, 5s, and 6s. In the in vitro, those embryos mature a little bit faster. And so we're looking at mostly 5s to 8s. We like to freeze 6, 7s, and 8s. And 8s are a little dangerous to freeze because, well, let's backtrack a little bit. A 4 is what we call a true morula. That's a true embryo. In vivo, those are awesome. Those are great to use. In vitro, they're too young because they're coming out on day 7. So you've got to remember that these are day 7 embryos, but it looks like a stage 4. So that embryo is behind. And so then a 5 would be an early blastocyst. A 6 would be a blastocyst. A 7 would be an expanded blastocyst. And then an 8 would be a hatching blastocyst. A 9 is hatched. And so 8s are sometimes dangerous to freeze because if they have started hatching, there's chance for them to get stuck in the straw when you're going to transfer them. 8 fresh has no problem, but 8 frozen, I'll freeze them if they're really good quality and they have a nice tight zona. But 6s and 7s are your best IVF embryos. If you can place 6s and 7s, grade 1s, you're going to be happy, and those rates are going to be very close to your conventionals. When you get your 8s or your 5s, that's when you're going to see the reduction in your conception rates. But there's still high quality embryos, and just depends on what your goals are. If your goals are conception rate, then let's just freeze 6 and 7 ones. If you are in the genetics business and you're trying to get the most out of these donors as possible, then let's try to put in some 5s, 5.2s. I mean, we have some clients that put in 5.3s. So don't get hung up so much on the stage, as long as if it's an IVF embryo and it's a 5 to 8, it can make pregnancies. And then the grades, a lot of people are like, I only got to put in grade 1s. Honestly, our grade 2s are not really behind our grade 1s. So we put in grade 2s all the time. Most of our clients put in grade 2s. We have some people that have a lot of experience in conventional, and so they're like stuck on, I have to put in grade 1s. And we'll do that for people. But it makes me sick when I dump these nice embryos down the drain.
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, we just calved another set of twins yesterday morning at 2 a.m., both the result of grade 2 embryos. So in that setting, we had grade 2s, which we do expect a little lower success rate with. And I believe they'd have been like 5.2s. They might have been 6.2s, but I didn't record that in it. I just recorded the 2 grade 2s went in. But we put in 2 because they were female sexed, so we weren't worried about having a male and a female on the same deal. And normally we'd anticipate like, well, this is just upping our odds of getting 1 pregnancy. But we had 2 different occasions in this last season where 2 grade 2 embryos went in and 2 live healthy heifer calves came out. And so, when people tell, oh yeah, I don't know, people, it's human nature to get really, really hung up on specific things, or, have your mark, this is the way, it's going to be, or this is my standard or whatever. Like, well, I mean, if we'd have pitched those 2 grade 2 embryos, especially with which grade 2 embryos those were, we'd have been pitching a lot of money down into the garbage can there. And so I think, grade 2 is just, and I mean, the data I've seen, and you can tell me if you've seen something different, would mark the difference between a grade 1 and grade 2 conception rate around that 5 to 10% mark rate as far as reduction in success rate in planning a grade 2 versus grade 1. But it's not like grade 1 has a 100% success rate and grade 2 has a 0. Right. It's like, okay, maybe grade 1 is 45-50 and grade 2 is 35-40, at most, if there's that much spread,
Yeah.
But what do you see?
We're about
what do you think?
2 to 5%.
Yeah. So even smaller. So I mean, if you were going to shoot in the middle of that random, couple numbers that we've looked at, 5% difference. And so when people say, oh man, it's all just make or break this 1 or 2, if 5%'s make or break, I guess,
Probably just because I'm in it every day and I hate throwing embryos away. In my personal herd, I put in a lot of grade 3s because I just hate throwing embryos away. Yeah. And we make pregnancies. Yeah, we make less, but we still make pregnancies. And on the value that these calves are, every pregnancy is worth it. But for the most part, I would tell people, if you're buying IVF embryos or you're making IVF embryos or trying to decide what to freeze, I mean, if it's a 5 to an 8, grade 1 or 2, you're going to be able to make pregnancies out of those. Your ideals are 6 ones and 7 ones.
Sure. Yep. So looking at stages a little bit, if you were looking at, we talked about conventionals and IVFs, and conventionals, most often we see a 4 to a 6 for a stage. IVF, most often we see a 6 to a 7. So when we're on implant day and we're looking at recipient management and which cows came in heat when, how would you try to line up, even if it, I mean, and I use the conventional and the IVF or the in vivo and the in vitro embryos just as an easy division. Like if someone doesn't know the stages, I would say assume your IVF embryos at large in general on average are older, and assume that your conventional or in vivo embryos on average in general are younger. So your younger heats or your shorter post heat interval on day of transfer gets a conventional, and your longer post heat interval gets the IVFs. But how would you line those up, or what are your thoughts on that as far as looking at the stage and lining it up to recip heats?
Yeah, it depends on what your recipients look like. If you're only have 5 or 10 recipients, and you're trying to maximize your conception rate, then you can match those up. Or if you're putting in, like us, we're putting in 100 to 200 embryos at a time. We have matched them up, and we haven't. And with that amount of recips, there's not a difference, a true statistical difference.
Sure.
So the stage is not necessarily the day of that embryo's development, but you can kind of use that as a guide. So if it's a day 6 heat, then you're better off to put in a stage 6 embryo. If it's a day 7 heat, then you're better off to put in a stage 7 embryo, day 8 heat, and stage 8 embryo. Now, that being said, I would put a 7 in anything. Honestly, we've had times where we have too many embryos and what we have recips. We'll grab a day 9 or a day 5. I'll put a 7 in them because 7s make pregnancies. So a 7 is a very versatile embryo. It can do about anything. 8s you want to put in to your older ones, and then 6s you want to put in your younger ones. But you can make it as complex as you want, but at the end of the day, if you're really putting in 6 to 8s and they're grade 1s, I'm not too concerned with what they go in. If you're talking grade 2s or 3s, then you need to plan a little bit more for that.
Right. Yep. And I think you're spot on there. I mean, looking at transfer day and basically when it comes down to which embryo is going into what cow, and this is kind of the opposite end of the equation, is, you can make the best embryos in the world, ship out world-class embryos out the window, just fantastic, perfect, ideal embryos. But if we stick them in poorly managed cows, it's all kind of moot point. And there's a lot of components there at play, and probably the least of which would be matching up, trying to line up days post heat, to the embryos, like you mentioned there. And this is kind of what we see when we go to implant day for us personally on my operation, is if I have enough embryos and enough recips all available, and everything else is held constant, which it never is. There's varying values of the embryos, there's varying qualities of the recips, or I know things about this one or that one, all of which will impact my selection decision of which embryo goes where. But if everything else is held constant, and I've got embryos ranging from a stage 4, or frozen conventional, all the way up to a stage 8 frozen IVF, I will stick the younger stages in the younger heats and the older stages in the older heats, everything else held constant. But if it's a day where I say, the embryos I've got to place range from 4 to 8 and all the cows are in the middle, or the opposite, they're all 7s, and I've got a big range, we're going to put them in anyway. You know what I mean? And you'll absolutely make pregnancies. And you've seen in large data sets, it's not going to make that much of a difference. But mostly for me, it's probably my OCD is like, well, there's all these tiny little details that I can't analyze everything about every embryo and everything about every recip. And the better we match them, it yields us a couple of extra pregnancies in a year. And
that is valuable. And if you do have the time and the technician availability to do that, absolutely do it. The point that you made, I think, is really critical for people to understand is conception has the majority to do with the recipient.
Yes. Yep.
If that recipient is in good condition, and not just good condition now, her chances of getting pregnant are what the environment and her body condition were 60 to 90 days ago.
Yes.
So if 60 to 90 days ago she was skinny or she was sick or you had a blizzard, that's going to affect how she's going to do as a recipient. And it's not necessarily what it is that day or the week before. It's a month or more before is what affects her.
Right.
So making sure that recipients are in good body condition, that they're healthy, and that they had good quality heats. If it's questionable if she had a heat, then either put in an embryo you're not too concerned about if you're going to throw it away, or skip her. And having a technician that is good at palpating CLs and knowing what's a good CL versus not, that definitely helps. Everybody loves to blame the IVF lab on, well, we didn't make pregnancies, it's the IVF lab.
Right.
We have run so much data and research and find if we make an embryo that makes it to a stage and grade, it can make pregnancies. The biggest variable is recips. Next would be environment and just the weather that day or 60 to 90 days before, and how the embryo is handled after it leaves the IVF lab. Then technician, then honestly, and people are like, well, you're just trying to pad yourself because you're the lab. Honestly, then it goes to the sire, the donor, then the lab. Because you'll have embryos that come out of the same operation, the same day, and some of them do fantastic and some of them don't. Why is that? There's so many other variables. You can't always blame the IVF lab.
Yes, and that, I mean, and you hit on a great point there, and not to say like, hey, let's just totally pad me and you, but I'm totally going to pad me and you here in the sense that when I look at it as well, when we talk about success rates, like you mentioned, repro is impacted by so many factors. So within my operation, we sell embryos, and people will say, well, what's the guarantee? Because there are companies that'll guarantee X percentage conception rate, and I tell people two things. Number one, I absolutely will take care of you. Number two, I am not guaranteeing a specific success rate. Well, why? Because most of the factors impacting that success rate have everything to do with the person buying, not the person selling. So I know when we send embryos out the door and we've sold them, I know that they're flush mates, embryos that we've transferred or embryos from the same donor, same sire. I know that we've gotten them to stick in a lot of cases around 70%, which is exceptionally high. I mean, in some cases, 80%, upwards of 80%. I don't tell people to expect that, because we've spent a long time and a lot of money and a lot of effort, and I'm probably way overly anal in all the details to run at that level. But I'm not going to tell people a specific percentage because I know the embryo's good going out. But if they go out and, like you mentioned, there were some real bad weather events, or the feed wasn't on point, or there's no mineral program in play, or we synced them but we hit them with the wrong shot on the wrong day, or when it comes to heat detection, nobody was on top of them to know exactly when they were in heat, or the technician that put them in hasn't implanted embryos in 20 years and only puts in 2. There's all these different factors that go, the person handling the embryos has no idea that you can't just like hold them out in the air and rub them off and take a look at, oh, this is this one, that sounds a little over the top, but it happens. Because most people are great, wonderful, fantastic, intelligent people, but they don't spend all day every day in an IVF lab, or they don't spend all day every day transferring embryos and in them and dealing with the cattle. So there's so many factors. Somebody can call me up and say, hey, we got none of them to stick. And am I going to do everything in my power to make that right or take care of them? 100%. It's a big deal to me to take care of the people that take care of us. But am I going to tell somebody when I sell them the embryos, oh yeah, mine got 70%, so I'm going to guarantee you 70, or really I'm not going to put a number to it. I'm not. And it's because most of the factors impacting embryo transfer success rate have to do with recipient management and just herd management at large. So running back through, I guess, some of those keys to success, and I guess we'll kind of wrap up with this point, unless there's anything in particular you'd like to add. But when we've done all of what we can do, I've done all of what I can do on donor and sire end, you've done all of what you can do to make a great embryo. What are the things you would tell somebody that's looking at buying embryos, or they bought an aspiration, or they've got embryos coming to them? How do we get those turned into calves? Because truthfully, this is the bigger challenge. This is the bigger hurdle. Making embryos we can do. You're very, very good at your job. We can make embryos. Mm-hmm. How do we make calves? Because this is where I feel like there's just a huge disconnect for a lot of people between, we made a bunch of embryos. How do we turn those into calves? What are the keys?
Yeah, the keys are taking care of your cows. And everybody thinks, well, I know my cows, I'm doing everything. If you want to be successful in an embryo program, you've got to take that management to the next level. And not everybody's ready for that. Sure. And you'll have people that are very successful with an AI program, and then they jump into an embryo program and they don't have success. Well, it's because it's another level of management. And I tell people it takes 3 years doing embryo work before you start seeing the payoffs. One, because it takes that long to get calves in the production system. Sure. But two, you've got to have those first 2 years of just figuring out the program and the processes and getting your protocols and procedures put together. Stress on the cows is the number one thing that's going to cause them not to stick or to abort, and so we've got to keep those cows from being stressed. We've got to have good nutrition, a good mineral program, and we just need to find people that we can trust to help us. Yeah. If you're going to come and work with us, we need you to trust us 100%, and we'll trust you. Yep. If you're just having some guy off the street come and do your work or come put in your embryos and there's not that trust there, then you're not going to probably have as much success. And embryo work it's got its ups and downs. 1 week is going to be great and the next week is going to be terrible. Right. And you've got to have the gut to stick with that. Yeah, if you quit after the first year, you're never going to see the upside of it. So like I said, it takes about 3 years. It just takes a higher level of management and just keying in on the details of their nutrition and their body condition, and just making sure that when those cows go to calve that somebody's there, because we have more calves that die after that than what actually die in utero. And right. So making sure that you're there taking care of calves, that your cattle management is where it needs to be.
Yeah, no, and I'd agree with that. And I look at it just like you said, I mean, well prior to transfer day. This isn't we talk about nutrition, and I think in some cases people think, well, I'm just going to dump a pile of feed to them or give them a shot of multi-min or whatever right at transfer time, and that's going to change anything. And truthfully, if anything, changing ration significantly right around transfer time is going to hurt you, or that's been our experience. We try to spike all of the things, the protein, the energy, the mineral, the whatever else, right at, and that system is responding to all these significant changes. That stress is introduced. We've actually decreased our success rates in those settings. So it's a year-round management effort. And when I'm looking at trying to get those cows to stick, I mean, we're making sure they're staying in good flesh year-round. They've got a premium mineral pack in front of them. We use Real Max year-round. We know for sure the cows that we're going to use have a sufficient postpartum interval. What do you guys recommend for postpartum as far as days post-calving before we look at putting an embryo into a cow?
Ideal 65 days. We'll go down to about 50 days, but right around that 60 days is best. Yeah.
So making sure that she's had enough time to recover after she's calved. And then we make sure we don't implant unless there's good heat, just like you'd mentioned. I mean, you can technically just synchronize estrus, just like with both AI and ET. You can just give a synchronization protocol and then implant all of them, whether they see a heat or not. And it's the same with AI. And will you get some pregnancies from that? Yes. You'll get non-responding cows that you still make an AI or an ET pregnancy. That happens. But for example, backing up even just to the basic AI side of things, we have an operation that I've AI'd for the last 10 years. We do a couple hundred heifers every spring for them. I've AI'd for them since college, good friends of mine. And the females that show heat, and this is just an AI setting, not even ET. The females that show heat, we run 70 to 75%. The females that don't show heat, it's 15 to 25%. And that's the same place, the same day, the same tech, the same semen, the same everything. So when it comes to synchronizing and implanting embryos, we're not just putting in $5 or $10 or $20 worth of semen. We're putting in hundreds of dollars, or in some cases thousands of dollars worth of embryos. And I want to see heat. And I want to know for sure exactly when that came in, because that's been another disconcerting moment for me in multiple cases where I've done some custom embryo work, or I've lined up, sets of recips, and we've lined up recip protocols, and I've set up to where, hey, we're going to bring in a technician and embryos on this day and use this as a co-op type herd. And we roll and say, okay, so when was this cow in heat? Well, I was out of town, you know what I mean? Or like, well, she's pink now, but like the sticker and Estrotect patch is pink now, but when did it go pink? Between this day and that day, I'm like, no, I need like AM, PM heat checks, and I need to know exactly when it went pink. And so I would say, good heat detection is a big deal on our end. And then having, like you said, a great technician and somebody you've got a relationship with and that you know and trust is doing their job, on every end. Just like, I know you're doing the lab stuff spot on. I know that when we have Carlos or Sean come in, I know they're very experienced, capable technicians. And then I know I've done everything I can on my end to control the nutrition, to control the mineral, to sync them up right. We monitor heat detections to an anal level, and we are very careful, even just with what embryo goes in what cow. But and as much as that as any, again, is matching even just value of embryo to level of reset. But there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to making calves. But certainly appreciate the role you play in that whole process. Is there anything else that comes to mind for you, Ty, after we've talked through all these components of a successful IVF program? Anything else that you would throw out there to somebody that's looking at it, and or how could they get in touch with you if they decided, hey, I'd like to do it? I'd sure be interested in having WinStar do the work and put up our embryos for us. How would they go about that?
Yeah, the biggest thing is call me or call somebody that you trust or call somebody that's done it and pick their brain about it. Learn about the process before you just dive into it. Mm-hmm. And then the biggest thing that is in your control that you can do to improve your success, both on the donor side, the recip side, is manage stress. That is the biggest thing. People don't understand how critical keeping those cortisol levels low are. That makes the biggest difference. So if you can learn how to handle those cattle in a stress-free environment, making sure that you're taking care of them whenever you're transporting them or when you're running them through the chute, keeping it quiet, low stressed, that's going to help you the most. And then finding somebody that you can trust to work with and then sticking to it. If you're going to do it, make sure that you're invested for at least those 3 years in order to be able to see the fruits of your labor. Right. If people want to get a hold of me, my email is the best. It's just tybarnardwsg@gmail.com. I'm old school. I like to talk on the phone or email, but my phone number is 208-681-6747. Feel free to call me. I'd love to talk with anybody about it. And even if you're just trying to get some consultation on what should I do with my herd, just call. Or I'm not going to charge you to talk to you. Just call and I'll explain the process and we'll figure out what fits your program the best.
You bet. Absolutely. And I can't recommend you and your work highly enough, Ty. I absolutely respect the work you've done and appreciate all of what you've done to accommodate some really challenging donor scenarios, semen scenarios. I mean, we've done it all. We've done reverse sort. We've done 50-year-old semen. We've done old cows, and we've got babies coming from all of them. And that's thanks to your work, and appreciate your expertise and being willing to share with me and take time today to record all of this and share with all the people that listen. And can't say thank you enough for being on the Got Any Cows podcast.
You bet. Appreciate it.
You're the man. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Got Any Cows podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. And visit us anytime at gotanycows.com.